I'm Linda Clare, Professor of Clinical Psychology of Ageing and Dementia at the University of Exeter. In this talk, I want to give a short introduction to great cognitive rehabilitation for people living with mild to moderate dementia. When I started out in dementia research, one thing that really came home to me was the importance of thinking about both the person and the context, the person as an individual and the person's relationships, environment and community. So from there, it was about trying to understand the experience of living with dementia as best I could and what might make that experience better or more manageable, or even enable the person with dementia to flourish. Being able to flourish comes from both inside and outside, from our own inner selves and from the context that surrounds us. To enable someone to flourish, we need to think and work from both these directions, individual and contextual. By individual, I mean understanding you as a person, acknowledging and respecting your identity, who you are, and coming alongside you to support you and enable you to fully use your own resources and strengths. By contextual, I mean the whole web of relationships surrounding you, the physical environment you live in, your community, and the attitudes in society that could affect your everyday experience. And we know that changes in context affect individual experience. And a really good example of this is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The enforced lack of social contact has increased stress and affected mental health. Changes in activity led people with dementia to feel they were losing skills through lack of use and to worry about whether they'd be able to regain those skills afterwards. And some people with dementia said that they wanted support to help regain the skills they felt they were losing due to lack of use. And that's a really good example of the way in which context can be disabling, just like the stairs in the picture here. In our case, the changed situation due to COVID created what we call excess disability. That's a disability you don't really need to have. Other examples of excess disability that might affect people with dementia might be loss of confidence due to knowing that you're forgetful, or feeling anxious because you know you're going to have trouble finding the right words to say. And of course, that's on top of the disability that comes from the brain changes themselves and the resulting symptoms of different types of dementia. The good news is there's something we can do to tackle disability, both disability and excess disability. It's not a magic solution and it's not a cure, but we can enable people to regain or maintain some skills that are important to them at a given time and that could make a difference to their daily lives and the ability to participate in society. And we have evidence for this from a programme of research extending now over 20 years. We call it the GREAT programme, Goal-Oriented Cognitive Rehabilitation for people living with Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, or GREAT CR for short. The NICE guideline published in 2018, suggests that services should consider offering cognitive rehabilitation to support functional ability for people with dementia. And one criterion in the Memory Services National Accreditation Programme, which sets standards for memory clinics, is that people should have access to cognitive rehabilitation according to clinical need. So what does GREAT CR involve, and what evidence do we have that it's helpful? When I was starting out in research, I was working with brain injury rehabilitation specialists on a project about memory rehabilitation, and I got the opportunity to work with people living with early stage dementia. There wasn't much written at the time to guide me, but I drew on what we knew about enabling people with brain injury. And I started working with several amazing people who were living with dementia and their families. Each of them had something specific they wanted to manage better or improve on. For example, Alan wanted to remember the names of people he met regularly at his social club. And Evelyn wanted to remember what day it was and what was happening that day. And together we figured out some strategies that helped. These are everyday things, some might say small or insignificant things, but being able to do these small things provides the foundation of our daily lives, our identity, our relationships, and our social connections. Remembering names meant that Alan didn't feel embarrassed and was able to carry on going to his club. Knowing what day it was meant that Evelyn's questions didn't irritate her husband and lead to arguments. So improving these small things helped the whole picture. And from these beginnings, we developed the approach that became great cognitive rehabilitation for people living with dementia. Great cognitive rehabilitation tackles the effects of cognitive impairment, such as memory problems, on our ability to carry out activities and engage in everyday life. on our functioning or functional ability. And we know that given the right support, people with mild to moderate dementia can adjust, can develop and apply strategies, and can learn some new skills with the right support. It's natural for us to try to develop strategies to cope with challenging situations. And sometimes these work well, but it's not always that easy. Sometimes help from a skilled practitioner can enable us to come up with a more effective plan. So in GREAT CR, we focus on what people with dementia themselves want to tackle. We call these things goals. I was trained to understand that rehabilitation or reablement is not something you do to someone, but something you do with someone. It's about working together and focusing on what is important and relevant to the person. And we work on cognitive rehabilitation goals in people's own everyday context, in the place where they live, because that's where they need to apply the new strategies. The kinds of goals that people choose to work on are very varied, but we do try to be as precise as possible about what the goal is so that everyone understands it. And we ask people to rate on a 1 to 10 scale how easy or difficult it is to do that activity at the moment. Then the cognitive rehabilitation practitioner looks at everything around that chosen goal, what it is the person needs to do or manage better, what the person is currently doing or could potentially do, where the problems are coming with this activity, and what needs to change to enable the person to achieve that goal. And having understood those things, the practitioner works with the person to develop a plan for tackling the goal. It might include finding ways of taking in or reactivating important information, or learning skills like how to use a smartphone or a household gadget. It might involve using aids and adaptations, or altering the surroundings in some way, such as putting things in a prominent place so they're easier to find. Or it might involve tackling things like anxiety and lack of confidence. It might be a number of those things together. And the practitioner will support the person to carry out the plan. Family members might be involved and help as well. The person with dementia, the family members and the practitioner can all then rate how things are progressing after a few weeks to see if the plan is working, and then they can make any adjustments if necessary. And they can keep making those ratings until they feel the goal has been sufficiently achieved. So using this approach, Alzheimer's Society funded us to do a small trial with people diagnosed with Alzheimer's to get some initial evidence. And occupational therapist Sue Evans was the CR practitioner. People who had cognitive rehab and worked on their goals improved their skills and abilities in those specific areas. And there was no change for people who had relaxation therapy, which was the comparison that we used, or who had no specific intervention. So in this chart, the blue bars show the average initial ratings of how people performed on those areas that were their goals, and the orange bars show the ratings following the intervention. And on the left, you see the group that had cognitive rehabilitation. In the middle is a group that had another therapy, relaxation therapy, which we chose because we thought it might be helpful and beneficial, but was not similar. And then on the far side, people who had no particular treatment at all, just carried on with their usual treatment. So you can see that the only difference was here for the cognitive rehabilitation group, whose attainment ratings increased. We then also did a similar trial, small trial for people living with Parkinsonian dementias, Parkinson's disease dementia and Lewy body dementia. And again, we compared cognitive rehabilitation with relaxation therapy by the same therapist and treatment as usual, so no specific extra intervention. So again, what we saw was that for the cognitive rehabilitation participants, those people who worked on their goals achieved improvements in skills and abilities in those areas. And those ratings were made both by the people themselves and by family members. There was no change as rated by the participant or the family member for people in the relaxation therapy group or in the treatment as usual group. These changes were not significantly different, whereas in the cognitive rehabilitation group, the changes were statistically significantly different. So there were significant improvements. Now, the addition in this trial was that we have a third bar, a grey bar, and that is the ratings 6 months after the end of cognitive rehabilitation. So the blue bars were made at the beginning, the orange bars will reflect the assessment done after 8 sessions. So 2 months later, weekly sessions for 8 weeks, and then the grey bar represents what was happening 6 months after that. And we can see that not only did the people who had cognitive rehabilitation improve, but they maintained those improvements 6 months later. And again, we can see that in both the ratings from the participants themselves and the ratings from the family members. So building on the early evidence, we were then funded by the National Institute of Health Research to do a large trial of great cognitive rehabilitation. And occupational therapist Jackie Poole then joined us on the trial team to train and support the practitioners. And we recruited nearly 500 people living with mild to moderate Alzheimer's, vascular or mixed dementia in 8 areas of England and Wales, as you can see on the map. So in this trial, we compared cognitive rehabilitation just to treatment as usual. We saw in the earlier trials that when we did another type of intervention that wasn't targeting the same things, it didn't lead to improvements in goal performance. So this time we were able to just compare cognitive rehabilitation and treatment as usual. And the results confirmed what we saw in the smaller trials. So people who had cognitive rehabilitation and worked on their goals improved their skills and abilities in those areas. And here you can see those ratings of the initial assessment, the post-intervention assessment. This time was after 10 sessions, and then the ratings another 6 months later. And those ratings made by participants themselves and their family carers. And in contrast, treatment as usual participants did not show any significant changes in how they managed with the goals that they chose. Sorry, what kind of goals did people choose in the GREAT trial? Well, people taking part in the trial chose to work on a lot of different kinds of things, and they really challenged the cognitive rehab practitioners to help come up with good strategies. The goals people chose could be grouped under several broad headings: keeping up interests and personal projects, being able to use appliances, devices and gadgets, managing everyday tasks like shopping and cooking, remembering names and important information or events, finding belongings, finding the way to places, and keeping in contact with family and friends and being able to engage in conversation. And you can see here that there were also different motivations that led people to choose those goals, which might be about their own independence or learning, or about safety or reassuring others and reducing dependence. So very varied. And I'll give you a few examples of goals that our participants successfully worked on. John overcame his fear of using his mobile phone that was undermining his ability to go out independently. Doris regained the confidence to collect her pension from the post office and learned to stay safe by remembering her door at night, to lock her door at night, which meant that she could stay in her own home as she wanted to do. Shahid started taking photographs again, an interest that he had dropped on getting his diagnosis. And he felt he became more able to take part in family conversations at mealtimes. And Gareth became able to cook his own meals without burning the food, and also learned to remember his granddaughter's name. Gareth was featured on the BBC Horizon documentary, which showed him working with cognitive rehab practitioner Sue Evans to achieve his goal. And you can see Sue here arriving to visit Gareth. An independent researcher who was not part of the GREAT CR team asked people who'd completed the trial and were in the cognitive rehabilitation group what they thought about GREAT cognitive rehab. As well as improvements in everyday activities, people said they found that their well-being and quality of life improved. Cognitive rehabilitation empowered them and helped them adjust to living with dementia, although it was still challenging for everyone knowing that dementia would progress. They felt more confident, less anxious and better able to cope. The practitioner enabled them to develop personalised strategies and provided information and support that were directly relevant to them. And that strong relationship with the practitioner was very important. For example, one participant with dementia said about the practitioner that the practitioner explored areas that I hadn't thought about, and I found it a great help. And a family member said The practitioner made you think about things that you thought you perhaps knew, but think about them in a different way and approach them in a different way. And that was really crucial for family members, because very often they would say to the practitioner at the beginning, well, I've tried everything, there's nothing else I can do. And then after they talked it through, the practitioner was able to make some suggestions that were different and that enabled them to manage things better. The next step for the GREAT team was to see if we could encourage NHS services to offer cognitive rehabilitation for people with dementia as part of the routine normal services. And Alzheimer's Society funded an implementation project, GREAT into Practice, or GREAT IP, that allowed us to work with several NHS services and other home care providers, and to train staff and then supervise them for a while they gained confidence as CR practitioners, and the hope that they would gradually develop into skilled practitioners who could support others and cascade those skills through their organisation. And we also had an opportunity to show that GREAT CR is relevant and useful for people living in care homes. But I'm focusing mainly on people living in the community here. So this project has showed that the benefits of cognitive rehabilitation when delivered as part of usual services are the same as the improvements people made in the research trials, and sometimes even better. And here again, you can see on the chart, this time the blue bars are the initial ratings, and the orange bars are the ratings after the person's course of GREAT Cognitive Rehabilitation. And we have ratings from the person with dementia, the family member, and the CR practitioner. And you can see they look very similar. And they all recorded significant improvements at the end of the course of GREAT Cognitive Rehabilitation. People thought that the intervention was useful, and everyone said they would recommend it to others. People with dementia and their families who received GREAT Cognitive Rehabilitation in this study were asked to fill in an anonymous questionnaire saying what they thought about it. And this slide shows some of the comments made by people with dementia and by carers. They talked about being able to do things they couldn't do before and feeling more confident. For example, one person said, I've become more independent and will now go out on my own regularly. I've attempted volunteering in a charity shop and will get shopping on my own. I'll let you read the others. And cognitive rehabilitation can benefit family members too. And this slide shows some of the comments made by family members. They found it helpful to identify different strategies and to see changes in the person with dementia. And some found that those changes reduced stress. For example, one person said, a big difference, a good outcome by realizing there are different strategies to manage the problems we face, which do help. It's just finding the right strategy and implementing them. And I'll let you read the rest again. And at this time, there are still upcoming initiatives from this project, which include offering training courses and developing various resources. So I will direct you in a minute to our website where you can keep an eye on what is coming up. But at this point, I'd like to reflect on what we've learned so far from our work on cognitive rehabilitation. We know that cognitive rehabilitation can help to improve or maintain specific everyday skills and activities. Of course, if commissioners and service providers are willing and able to fund it. Cognitive rehabilitation can form a very useful component of post-diagnostic support, community reablement or home care packages, and even enablement for people living in residential care settings. People might have more than one episode of cognitive rehabilitation as needs change over time. And because it's based around personal goals, cognitive rehabilitation can potentially be adapted for different settings or cultures, or different modes, such as remote or online delivery. And this flexibility, I think, is very important. So, thinking about the future, I would like to see services using a rehabilitation-based model as a focus for what they do. And in that model, services can have a framework for providing positive support from the point of diagnosis onwards. that enables people living with dementia to function as well as they possibly can, to be as independent as they can be and wish to be, to have as much control as possible over daily life, to engage in meaningful roles and activities, to maintain a strong sense of identity, and to sustain positive relationships. And all of that, of course, should benefit their families equally. I'd like to give the last word to a person living with dementia. This is Carol, who was a participant in the GREAT trial and then joined the GREAT into Practice project team as a co-investigator. You can see Carol telling her story on our website, which I will direct you to in a moment. But I'd like to share with you some of Carol's thoughts about GREAT Cognitive Rehabilitation. Carol says, "GREAT Cognitive Rehabilitation has made a massive difference to my life with dementia, giving me tools and techniques I need to find a way to cope with the problems that get in the way of me living my life day to day. I'm involved as part of the GREAT Cognitive Rehabilitation team because I'm living proof of the value that this therapy can have for people with dementia. And I passionately want to see it rolled out across the country to help as many people like me live as well as possible with their dementia." The research I've described here has been a tremendous team effort, and I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who've contributed to making it possible, too many to list individually here, and also our funders who have supported us with developing this approach. Finally, if you would like more information about anything I've covered in this talk, please look at our websites, which are listed here. If you can't find what you need, please send us an email and we'll do our best to help. Thank you very much.